I couldn't believe the text I just received. My father, with that familiar mix of anger and control, demanded I attend Vivian's wedding, or he would cut my nephew's tuition. For a moment, I froze, heart pounding, caught between obeying him and protecting my hard-earned independence. Little did they know, I wasn't the struggling daughter they imagined. I had graduated top of my class, built a six-figure income, and quietly created a life entirely my own. But should I reveal everything now, or play along for a little longer? Can I really let them think they still have control over me? The moment I saw my father's message, a chill ran down my spine. His words were precise, cutting, and familiar in their oppressive tone. "Clara, you will attend Vivian's wedding. If not, your nephew's tuition is gone." My coffee trembled in my hand, spilling slightly over the edge of the cup, and my heart lurched as though it had skipped a beat. For a fraction of a second, I considered just closing the message and pretending I hadn't read it. But the reality was too stark. He was serious. He always was. His threats were never empty, and I knew my nephew's education would be the collateral for his sense of control. I took a deep breath, forcing my pulse to settle as I stared at the text. Every instinct screamed at me to push back, to reject his dominance outright. Yet a small, nagging part of me remembered the countless times my decisions had been dismissed, my accomplishments minimized, even ignored entirely. How many times had I quietly cleaned up after his mistakes, or smiled while he praised Vivian as if she were the only child worth noticing? The memory sent a wave of anger through me, sharp and immediate, but just beneath it, the familiar knot of guilt began to form. I was supposed to care about his feelings. I was supposed to obey. That's what he expected of me. That's what family demanded. My fingers hovered over my phone, trembling slightly as I considered the possibilities. Could I truly defy him this time? Or would the consequences, financial and emotional, be too much for my family to bear? I felt a pulse of frustration surge through me, a need to shout, to let him know I was not a girl in need of permission anymore. But I bit my lip. Instead, I allowed myself a moment to sit with the tension, letting the weight of the situation settle around me like a heavy fog. The uncertainty was intoxicating, and in some strange way, it was exhilarating. For years, I had lived in the shadows of his expectations and Vivian's perfection. Perhaps now, there was a chance to finally step into the light. As I sipped my coffee, I let my mind wander, revisiting the memories of my younger years. I had worked tirelessly, balancing part-time jobs while excelling in school, staying up late night after night to ensure that my scholarship, my future, and eventually my independence were secure. I remembered the day I graduated top of my class, the applause ringing in my ears, a small but fiercely proud smile on my face. That victory was mine, yet it had been quietly tucked away, uncelebrated by the family that had always prioritized Vivian's achievements. I chuckled softly to myself, a hint of irony curling at the edges of my lips. Little did they know, I had built a life entirely my own, one that didn't depend on their recognition or approval. My startup, still in its early stages at the time, had flourished beyond anyone's expectations. My bank account, my autonomy, my pride, each was a secret fortress I had constructed carefully, brick by brick, away from prying eyes. And yet, despite all of that, here I was, being summoned to perform once again on their stage, forced to wear the mask of the dutiful daughter while keeping my true self hidden. The absurdity of it made me smile faintly, but the smile was tinged with exhaustion. I had spent so long proving my worth, and now, the very people I had outgrown were demanding that I shrink myself to fit their narrative. I could feel the familiar ache of injustice press against my ribs, a subtle but unrelenting pressure. My gaze drifted to the window, watching as the city moved on indifferently outside. Did they understand the magnitude of what they were asking? Did they even realize that the little girl they once thought they knew had long ceased to exist? There was a pause in my thoughts, a quiet moment of reflection, and I let myself breathe fully for the first time that morning. I thought of the countless nights I had poured over spreadsheets and business plans, of the risks I had taken to secure every single dollar that now made me untouchable in ways they could not yet fathom. I considered Vivienne, blissfully unaware of the truths that separated us. She would always be golden in their eyes, perfect and admired, but she didn't know what it took to survive and succeed without their safety net. A small, private part of me felt almost smug at the thought, though I forced it down quickly. I was not here to gloat. I was here to plan. Finishing the last sip of coffee, I set the cup down with deliberate care. My fingers, once trembling, now felt steady, purposeful. I would attend the wedding, yes, but on my own terms. I would observe, calculate, and, when the time was right, reveal exactly who I had become in a way they could not dismiss. There was a thrill in that thought, a quiet excitement that bubbled beneath the surface. The stakes had never been higher, the tension never so acute, and yet, for the first time in years, I felt the unmistakable pulse of anticipation. The game was in motion, and I was finally in control of how it would unfold. I allowed myself one more moment to absorb the quiet solitude of my apartment, the early morning light filtering through the blinds. For a fleeting second, I imagined their faces when they discovered what I had built without them, when they realized that the daughter they had underestimated was not only independent, but unstoppable. My heart quickened at the thought, and a small, sly smile crept across my face. The wedding would be more than a celebration of Vivienne's life. It would be the first act in a careful, deliberate revelation of mine, a story they could not ignore. And as I stepped toward the door, keys in hand, I knew that this was the beginning of something far greater than obedience, far greater than expectation. This was my story, my unveiling, and the first move had already been made. The apartment around me hummed with the low buzz of computers and the faint scent of coffee, but my mind was elsewhere, dancing along the edges of memories and calculations. No one in the office, or in my family, knew the real Clara Bennett. To them, I was polite, composed, occasionally distant, but always harmless, always small. What they didn't see was the empire I had quietly built, piece by piece, from my first coding projects to the startup that now thrived under my careful guidance. Our software solution had garnered attention from investors, tech communities, and even a few international media outlets. The irony was delicious. The daughter they underestimated, the good girl who needed their permission, was now a recognized name in a world they barely understood. I leaned back in my chair, glancing at the glowing monitor that displayed analytics and project dashboards, the figures climbing steadily as if nodding in approval. My team worked diligently around me, oblivious to the storm brewing inside my head. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my independence. I had no one to answer to but myself. My choices, my successes, my failures, they were mine alone. The thrill of that realization pulsed through me like electricity, a reminder that the life I lived outside the shadows of my father and Vivienne was not just a rebellion, it was a triumph. Then came the unexpected question. One of my colleagues, David, leaned over my desk with an easy smile and asked, "So, Clara, what's your family like? Do they know about all this?" His tone was casual, but I could sense the curiosity, the subtle intrigue in his voice. For a second, my mind raced, calculating the perfect response, the safest way to keep the walls I had built intact. Could I reveal even a hint of what I had accomplished outside their expectations? No, not yet. My lips curved into a small, polite smile. "They don't really understand what I do," I said lightly, letting the words drift like smoke, masking the intensity beneath. David nodded, seemingly accepting the answer, but I could feel my pulse quicken. Every question about family was a minefield, and the thought of someone getting too close to the truth made my stomach tighten. That brief encounter left me uneasy yet energized. I realized that this dual existence, one public, one secret, was both a blessing and a curse. I was free, yes, but I was also constantly alert, calculating how much I could reveal and to whom. The balance of control was delicate, precarious, and utterly exhilarating. I couldn't let anyone, especially my father, know that the girl he thought he could manipulate had already escaped his grasp entirely. Later that evening, as I poured myself a glass of wine, my thoughts drifted back further to the shadows of my past. Growing up, life with my father had always been a test I never passed in his eyes. Every achievement I earned was quickly overshadowed by Vivian's brilliance. She was praised for her beauty, her charm, her grades. I was simply there, always there, quietly working, quietly excelling, yet seldom recognized. I could feel the familiar sting of invisibility creep back, a reminder of the countless nights I had stayed awake, trying to prove my worth to a man who would never see it. The memories were bitter, but they also fueled a quiet, simmering resolve. I remembered the first time I had tried to confront him, to demand acknowledgement for something I had done, a science fair win in middle school, a scholarship award in high school. I had stood there, heart racing, with my hands clenched, expecting praise or at least a nod of recognition. Instead, he had shrugged and turned his attention to Vivian, complimenting her efforts and ignoring me entirely. The humiliation had burned, sharp and immediate, but instead of breaking me, it had planted a seed of determination. I would not seek approval from someone incapable of giving it. I would create a life that spoke for itself. Sitting there in the quiet, I allowed myself a moment of vulnerability, sipping the wine as the memories washed over me. The ache of those long-ago slights was still there, a subtle reminder of the girl I had been, but it no longer defined me. Instead, it was the foundation on which I had built Clara Bennett, the woman who could command boardrooms, negotiate with investors, and make life-altering decisions without hesitation. Yet even as I felt this pride, a small part of me longed for recognition, for a glimpse of the validation that had always been withheld. It was this tension, the push and pull between triumph and desire for acceptance, that shaped my every move. The night stretched on, quiet except for the soft hum of the city below, and I found myself imagining the future. Vivian would be dazzling at her wedding, basking in the attention of family and friends, oblivious to the truths I carried. And I, Clara Bennett, would watch, calculating and poised, ready to reveal, at precisely the right moment, the depth of my independence and the success they had all ignored. The thought sent a thrill through me, a sense of power that was subtle yet intoxicating. This was not revenge. It was revelation, a measured, undeniable assertion of my life and my choices. I set the glass down and stretched, feeling a rare sense of calm settle over me. The weight of secrecy, the careful balance of my two lives, was heavy but manageable. Every experience, every slight, every ignored accomplishment had led me here. I was ready to step into a world that thought it knew me and quietly, brilliantly, show them they had never truly understood a thing. The moment I stepped into the grand ballroom, the air was thick with the scent of flowers, perfume, and the unspoken weight of expectation. Guests milled about, laughter spilling over polished floors, but my eyes immediately found her. Vivian Bennett, radiant in her designer gown, was everything my father ever wanted. Flawless, charming, admired. Cameras flashed as she moved gracefully among the crowd, every smile calculated to perfection, every gesture choreographed to display the image of the golden daughter. My stomach tightened as I felt the familiar, unwanted comparison pressing against my ribs. Here I was, invisible among the sparkle, forced to occupy the shadows of her spotlight. I took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, trying to steady the mix of irritation and resignation coiling in my chest. The photographer called my name, and I stepped into view, adjusting my dress, masking the swell of anger beneath a carefully neutral expression. It was not the first time I had been reduced to supporting the star of the family, yet the sting never dulled. Vivian's eyes met mine briefly, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps just polite acknowledgement, but I could see the unspoken message in her expression. I was the backdrop to her celebration, the predictable presence at the edge of every photograph, every compliment, every toast. I wandered closer to the edge of the dance floor, observing the scene. Aunts whispered, cousins glanced, and my father's approving nods fell upon Vivian like rain on a crown. I could feel their eyes brush against me occasionally, comparing, measuring, as if I were still the lesser sister, the one who might accidentally tarnish the perfection they adored. My mind flickered with frustration. Why should I shrink myself to fit their narrative? I wanted to speak up, to interrupt the carefully curated scene, but I forced myself to remain still, silent, calculating. The micro cliffhanger. As Vivian laughed with a distant cousin, my pulse quickened with a sudden, reckless thought. What if I dared to disrupt the flawless image they all worshipped just a little? Seeking refuge, I drifted toward a quiet corner, surveying the room from behind a tall potted plant. The soft lighting cast gentle shadows, and for a moment, the world slowed. I could hear the distant clink of glasses, the hum of polite conversation, but here, in my little sanctuary, I allowed my mind to wander. I reminded myself that I had survived worse, that the girl who once bent beneath the weight of expectations had long since learned to carry herself differently. I didn't need to prove anything tonight, not to Vivian, not to my father, not to anyone who believed they still had control over me. Yet observation alone was not enough. My analytical mind, honed by years of managing complex projects and leading teams, began to map the room, noting interactions, alliances, and subtle dynamics. I noticed how certain relatives glanced at me, their expressions alternating between mild curiosity and unspoken judgment. Whispers floated from table to table, commenting on dresses, demeanor, and, naturally, Vivian's brilliance. I felt the old pang of being measured, scrutinized, weighed against someone else. But this time, instead of shrinking, I smiled inwardly. This was my playground, my field to study, and my plan was beginning to form. A subtle twist curled in my thoughts. A small, strategic move here, a calculated comment there. No one would suspect, but the seeds of surprise were being planted. I imagined the reactions, quiet yet deliberate, a series of tiny ripples that could unsettle the carefully maintained balance. Not revenge, no, but revelation. Each person who glanced at me expecting passivity would be met with a different presence, a subtle assertion of independence and wit. I could feel the thrill beneath the surface, a slow-building anticipation that made the hours stretch deliciously. The ballroom, once intimidating, transformed into a chessboard where I was both player and observer, poised to reveal carefully hidden truths at precisely the right moments. Still, I needed to pause, to breathe. I sipped my water slowly, feeling the cool liquid soothe the tension coiling in my shoulders. The room's bright lights reflected off the polished floor, and I watched Vivian interact with our father, basking in his pride, and I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Frustration, certainly, but also compassion, tempered with amusement. She had been molded to fit the golden image, just as I had been forced into the shadowed role. The contrast, stark and glaring, reminded me that control and perception were illusions. I could navigate this world on my own terms, and tonight would be the first demonstration. I allowed my gaze to linger on the corners of the room, noting details that others missed, the slight hesitation in a cousin's smile, the subtle envy in a friend's eyes, the tiny misstep in the coordination of the wedding party. These details, invisible to most, were my advantages. I could maneuver quietly, planting suggestions and observing responses, all without revealing the depth of my power. The micro cliffhanger here was a thought I barely allowed myself to entertain. What if, tonight, I quietly orchestrated a moment that no one expected, a gentle disruption of the perfect narrative to hint that I, too, had my place in this story? Finding a small alcove, I leaned against the wall, allowing the noise to wash around me while I planned. I whispered softly to myself, a private vow hidden in the hum of the celebration. I don't need to prove anything tonight. Not yet. The words grounded me, offering a moment of emotional respite. This pause, this small self-acknowledgement, reminded me that I controlled my responses, my visibility, my impact. I wasn't powerless here. I was patient, calculating, and ready. As I straightened, I caught Vivian's eye again. Her smile, radiant and unknowing, sparked that reckless, daring thought once more. The evening stretched ahead, filled with possibility and strategy. I wasn't just attending a wedding. I was observing, calculating, preparing, and waiting. Every smile I returned, every word I spoke, would carry the weight of subtle assertion, the quiet foretelling of a revelation yet to come. The tension was electric, but the calm beneath it, the knowledge of my hidden strength, was far more exhilarating. Tonight, I was invisible, but soon, very soon, that would change. The room was alive with laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of conversation, yet I felt an electric tension building inside me, sharper than any I had felt that evening. Vivian floated past, radiant as ever, receiving compliments like gifts she had always expected. Every glance, every laugh, every toast reminded me of the invisible cage I had spent decades navigating. But now, after years of quiet calculation and deliberate patience, I was ready. Timing, I knew, was everything. I waited until the speeches had reached a lull, when all eyes were briefly drawn away and I rose from my seat. The chatter dimmed just enough that my presence could not be ignored, but not so much that I would seem conspicuous. I cleared my throat, a subtle signal that I was about to speak, and felt every eye in the room flick toward me, my father's brow knitted with suspicion. Vivian's smile faltered slightly, a hint of curiosity breaking through her practiced composure. "I just wanted to say a few words," I began, my voice calm, measured, but carrying an undercurrent of certainty that demanded attention. I paused, letting the room still around me, hearts flicking like moths toward the flame of this unexpected intrusion. Some of you may not know this, but I graduated top of my class, and over the past few years, I've been running my own company. Our projects have grown internationally, and I've built a life I never needed anyone's approval to create. A murmur passed through the crowd, subtle but audible. Faces shifted. My father's lips parted, an expression of shock freezing him in place. Vivian's eyes widened slightly, her carefully constructed image momentarily cracked. The air was thick with disbelief, tension hanging so heavy that I could almost touch it. I didn't rush, didn't emphasize my success further. I let the silence stretch, and in that pause, I introduced the twist they could not have anticipated. "And," I continued, letting my gaze sweep across the room, "I've also quietly funded a scholarship program for underprivileged students in our city. Some of them are thriving now because of opportunities I never had myself. I suppose you could say I've been working on building a future that doesn't rely on old expectations or familiar approval." The effect was instantaneous. A wave of reactions rippled through the room. My father's face went pale, his jaw tightening as fury battled disbelief. Vivian's hands trembled slightly, her perfect composure faltering as she tried to process what she had just heard. Whispers rose from distant relatives, their expressions a blend of astonishment and newfound respect. The micro cliffhanger pulsed through the room. No one had seen this coming. I scanned the faces of my extended family, catching glances of subtle admiration from unexpected corners, cousins who had previously whispered critiques, aunts who had always smirked at my apparent lack of ambition. Even a few of Vivian's friends exchanged looks that betrayed quiet support. The twist compounded. I realized I had not only unsettled my father and sister, but I had also shifted the undercurrents of the entire room. Alliances were subtly realigning in my favor, and the power dynamics, long thought fixed, began to tremble. My father's voice broke through the murmurs, sharp and trembling. "Clara, how could you keep all of this from us?" The anger was real, but so was the shock, mingled with the faintest trace of fear. He had always believed he had full control, that any deviation from his expectations would be visible immediately. Yet here I stood, fully autonomous, my success undeniable, and the realization seemed to shake him more than words could convey. Vivian, still clutching her bouquet, found herself at a loss. She had anticipated jealousy, perhaps a minor protest, but nothing of this magnitude. Her golden image, carefully maintained, had been subtly challenged, not by confrontation or aggression, but by the quiet assertion of a life fully lived outside their sphere. The room's energy shifted, some guests exchanging knowing glances, a few nodding almost imperceptibly in approval. Hidden allies, those I had never expected, had begun to surface quietly, their support discreet yet unmistakable. I allowed myself a small, controlled smile, the kind that hints at confidence without arrogance, a smile that carried the weight of unspoken victories and carefully plotted strategy. My eyes caught those of a few relatives who had previously doubted me, and I could see the subtle acknowledgement, the silent admission that perhaps they had misjudged me. The micro cliffhanger lingered. What would I do next? How far would this revelation extend its influence? The room was mine to observe, to navigate, and the possibilities stretched tantalizingly ahead. I took a step back, letting the moment breathe, letting them absorb not only my words but the authority behind them. It was a delicate balance, showcasing power without aggression, revelation without spectacle. In that balance, I found a satisfaction deeper than any applause, a recognition not sought from others but inherently understood by myself. The subtle drama unfolding, the shock, the realignment, the whispered admiration, was a testament to patience, strategy, and self-determination. By the time I returned to my seat, the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. My father, still in partial disbelief, sat rigidly, his authority challenged in a manner he could neither fully articulate nor easily recover from. Vivian's radiant composure returned only superficially, masking a tremor of doubt beneath. And me? I sat quietly, sipping my drink, heart steady, mind racing. I had struck the first deliberate blow in a game of revelation and assertion, and I was fully aware that tonight, everything had changed. The wedding continued, laughter and conversation resuming, but beneath the surface, a subtle tension lingered. The room was charged with expectation, curiosity, and silent acknowledgement of my presence in a way it had never been before. And in that moment, I let a small, knowing smile spread across my face, eyes glinting with the thrill of unseen victories as the question hovered unspoken. What would I reveal next, and how far would the ripple of this revelation reach? The morning after Vivian's wedding, the house was quieter than I had anticipated. Gone were the clinking glasses, the murmurs of congratulations, and the low hum of polite laughter. In its place lingered a heavy silence, punctuated only by the distant traffic and the soft creak of floorboards as I stepped cautiously into the familiar hallway. My father sat at the kitchen table, hands clasped tightly around his coffee mug, staring into the liquid as though it contained some hidden truth. For the first time in years, I saw uncertainty in his posture, a tremor of vulnerability that had rarely, if ever, been there before. He looked up as I approached, and our eyes met. The usual sternness, the immediate assertion of authority, was absent. Instead, there was a tentative curiosity, a slow recognition that the daughter he had attempted to control for decades was not only independent but also unshakably self-assured. The twist was subtle but undeniable. He was beginning to reflect, to question the very foundation of his expectations. His voice, when he finally spoke, was lower than I remembered. "Clara, I didn't realize." I nodded, choosing silence over response. Words, I had learned, could often betray subtle frustration or pride, both of which I wanted to temper. Let him come to his own understanding. Let him wrestle with the reality that his influence, long assumed absolute, had boundaries he had never anticipated. It was almost fascinating the way his mind seemed to churn silently, processing what he had seen, what he had missed, and what he now could no longer control. I could see the flickers of memory, instances when I had been dismissed, overshadowed, yet remained resolute, building my own life quietly, without confrontation, without fanfare. In that quiet observation, I felt a sense of satisfaction, not of triumph, but of clarity. The dynamics of our family were shifting subtly, imperceptibly perhaps to others, but unmistakable to me. I allowed myself a moment to breathe, to let the tension ease slightly, and in that pause, I recognized the power in restraint. The micro cliffhanger was internal this time. Would my father fully comprehend the magnitude of the shift, or would he cling stubbornly to old expectations? Vivian entered the room shortly after, still in her wedding attire, her composure carefully maintained, but I could see the subtle cracks in the golden veneer. She hesitated as she approached, a small frown creasing her forehead. I could sense the realization forming, slowly, carefully. Success, influence, and respect were not guaranteed by familial favoritism, by golden status, or by parental approval alone. They had to be earned, observed, and, at times, quietly asserted. She spoke first, her voice tentative. "Clara, I didn't know. I didn't realize how much you've done, what you've accomplished." Her eyes flicked away, then back, as if seeking permission to acknowledge the truth. There was no resentment, only an awkward mixture of admiration and discomfort. Her recognition was a momentary victory, subtle yet profound. The twist here was not dramatic, but in its quiet revelation lay a depth that made the air between us shift imperceptibly. I smiled faintly, choosing my words carefully. "Vivian, it's not about recognition. I'm glad for your happiness, truly. I've built my life the way I needed to, and it doesn't diminish yours in the least." The words were soft, measured, and deliberate. I was asserting my boundary, my autonomy, without confrontation, without creating division. The room's energy, once thick with comparison and tension, began to ease slightly. The subtle rhythm of emotional pause, the breath between words, the small nod of acknowledgement, created space for all of us to reflect. My father finally spoke again, a whisper of vulnerability breaking through his habitual authority. I always thought I knew what was best, but maybe I've been too rigid, too focused on appearances." The statement was simple, almost mundane, yet it carried the weight of decades of unexamined control and expectations. I didn't respond immediately. I let him sit with it, let him feel the shift in the balance, and in that stillness I found the satisfaction of subtle victory, a recognition not won through confrontation, but through the undeniable presence of my independence. Vivian moved closer, her expression softening. "I think I understand now," she said quietly. "It's not about who shines brighter in Dad's eyes, it's about what we choose to do with ourselves." The acknowledgement hung between us, a bridge over years of unspoken tension, a quiet acceptance that respect and admiration could not be dictated, only earned. The micro cliffhanger remained, faint but persistent. What would the family dynamic look like going forward now that the scales had begun to shift? I settled into a chair, allowing the moment to breathe. The air, heavy with reflection and subtle reconciliation, was both calming and invigorating. I had maintained my autonomy, set boundaries, and asserted my presence without aggression. The quiet power of patience, observation, and strategic revelation had altered the family's equilibrium. My father and Vivian were both processing, both adjusting, and in the gentle pause of mutual recognition, I found a sense of emotional release, a relief tempered with anticipation for the subtle changes yet to come. I looked out the window at the morning light spilling across the city and took a deep, grounding breath. The tension had not disappeared, nor had old habits been erased, but a new rhythm had emerged, one where I could care for my family, remain present, yet stand firmly in my own space, untethered by the invisible strings of expectation. The satisfaction was quiet, profound, and lasting, a shift that would ripple through the days ahead, influencing interactions in ways only subtly noticeable yet undeniable to those who had truly seen the change. The morning light poured through the tall windows of my apartment, illuminating the sleek lines of my workspace and the quiet hum of productivity that had become my constant companion. It was a life I had meticulously constructed, one free from the dictates of expectation and the shadows of favoritism. I had grown into my autonomy, fully aware that each choice, each decision, carried the weight of both risk and reward. My company was thriving, the latest projects exceeding every projection I had quietly set for myself, and the satisfaction was deeper than applause or approval. It was rooted in the undeniable knowledge that I had built everything on my own terms. I walked over to the balcony and gazed at the city sprawled beneath me, alive with motion and opportunity. There was a subtle joy in observing it from a position of independence, knowing that my own life moved according to the pace I determined. The freedom was intoxicating, yet grounding. Every success was a testament to patience, planning, and resilience, a reminder that my worth had never been contingent on validation from others, not even my family. Earlier that week, I had caught a glimpse of Vivian during a casual family brunch. She had approached me with a hesitant smile, her usual confident demeanor softened by an unspoken acknowledgement. "Clara, I can see now why everyone talks about your work. I didn't realize—" Her voice trailed off, the words hanging in the air like delicate threads of recognition. I returned her smile, subtle and knowing, allowing the small twist of respect to resonate without a word of triumph or condescension. The moment was fleeting, but it carried a depth that could not be ignored. Vivian's surprise was genuine, tempered by admiration, and in it I felt the quiet satisfaction of having reshaped her perception, not with confrontation, but with the undeniable presence of my accomplishments. As the day progressed, I found myself reflecting on the subtle shifts within my family. My father had begun to adapt, not entirely, but enough to recognize that his control over my choices had loosened. He still operated from his ingrained patterns, still occasionally glanced at me with an expectant look, but now there was hesitation, a pause that suggested a new awareness. His authority, long assumed absolute, now existed alongside a recognition that I had constructed a life of value independent of his approval. The tension, once oppressive, had softened into something more manageable, a nuanced dynamic that allowed for both connection and autonomy. I spent the afternoon in my office, reviewing project reports and planning the next phase of growth. Even in these mundane tasks, there was a sense of liberation I had never known before, a rhythm guided entirely by my judgment. The contrast with the family gatherings I had endured earlier in the year was stark. There, every smile, every gesture was measured, every word weighed against invisible expectations. Here, every choice was mine, unmediated and unjudged, and the exhilaration of that freedom was as grounding as it was empowering. Later, I received a brief message from Vivian, casual, yet tinged with sincerity. "I hope we can talk soon. I'd like to understand more about everything you've built." I paused, the words stirring a warmth I had not anticipated. It was not an invitation to subjugation or comparison, but an acknowledgement, a subtle bridge over the years of competition and misunderstanding. I typed a simple reply, careful in tone. "I'd like that too." The brevity of the exchange belied its significance. Respect had begun to replace rivalry, and a new chapter, unspoken but palpable, was emerging. That evening, the family gathered for a small, informal dinner. The atmosphere was lighter, still layered with remnants of past tension, yet softened by the unspoken shifts of understanding. I noticed subtle glances, small nods of recognition, a few whispered compliments that had never been shared before. My father engaged in conversation without the usual sharp edge of authority, his comments tempered with a growing awareness of my independence. Vivian laughed more freely, though her eyes occasionally lingered on me, measuring, reflecting, reconsidering. The scene was far from perfect, far from the idealized notion of familial harmony, yet it felt real, authentic, and sustainable. As I sat back, taking in the scene, I allowed a small smile to play at the corners of my lips. This was the balance I had been striving for. A life rich in personal achievement, autonomy, and fulfillment, paired with relationships that acknowledged my presence without suffocating it. There remained the occasional friction, the minor misunderstandings, the lingering traces of past favoritism, but those were natural, part of a realistic family dynamic. The true victory lay in the equilibrium I had established, in the quiet assertion of self that no one could undermine. I lingered in that moment, savoring the subtle symphony of connection and independence, of respect earned quietly and presence acknowledged without fanfare. The city lights twinkled as dusk fell, a reminder that life was ongoing, dynamic, and full of opportunity. I had stepped into my role not as a challenger or adversary, but as a fully realized individual capable of both empathy and assertion. And in that gentle, deliberate balance, I realized the final truth. Golden independence was not about dazzling triumphs or dramatic confrontations. It was about integrity, patience, and the courage to remain steadfast to oneself while navigating the world, including family, on terms that honored both achievement and affection. I was Clara Bennett, autonomous, respected, and quietly triumphant, with a life that was mine entirely, yet intertwined with the family that slowly but surely was learning to see me as I had always been.